Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has once again appeared in public to repeat the same line he's been repeating for years, as if saying them again will finally make them true. Now, this time he declared, once again, that the so-called special military operation will reach its logical conclusion. He has been promising that result since 2022. At this point, the deadline has started to sound like Russian construction plans. By the end of the year, we're not sure which year per se, but definitely by the end of one of them.
Начать с того, чем вы закончили. Территория – это важно, это наша историческая территория, абсолютно точно. Россия создавалась таким образом, что это всегда было частью России, здесь вопроса нет. Просто это естественная вещь, факт исторический. И даже при образовании, создании Советского Союза шел спор, я уже говорил об этом. Донбасс вошел в состав РСФСР, а потом Владимир Ильич решил, как он выразился, это прямая речь из документа, перерешать. И он перерешил, и все, Донбасс отдали в Украину. Вот. Ну, вот так вот сложилось. Сейчас я не буду никак комментировать то, что произошло. Но дело не только в этом, дело в людях. В людях, которые не смирились с госпереворотом на Украине в 2014 году. И против них начали воевать. Причем воевать начали с использованием артиллерии, тяжелой техники, танков и самолетов. Вот с чего все началось. Вот когда началась война. Мы пытаемся ее закончить. Вынуждены делать это вооруженным путем. И мы, безусловно, доведем это дело до логического завершения, до достижения цели специальной военной операции.
So, did he say anything new? Of course not. Putin once again declared Donbas to be Russian territory, calling it a historical fact. It didn't really specify in which timeline this fact appears, but it certainly ain't ours. Now, he also insisted that the occupied Ukrainian regions have always been part of Russia, which naturally raises the question, if they've always been yours, why have you been bombing them every day? If this is meant to be the Russian love language, then that would explain a lot. And this brings us back to his promised logical conclusion. Inside the Kremlin, it sounds definitive, but outside it looks like another attempt to twist history and geography into whatever shape needed on the day. At this point, he treats map like improv material, and he's not alone, by the way. This week, Trump also managed to redefine Crimea, the peninsula, by saying it's surrounded by ocean on 4 sides. Guys, come on. Is being bad at geography a prerequisite for world leaders now? Did everyone just stop checking the map at the same time? And anyways, Putin keeps presenting himself as a strategic genius, but his version of a logical conclusion is simply an outgoing list of mistakes that are becoming harder to hide. Constant appeals to historical facts and territories that have always belonged to Russia did not really legitimize anything. They highlight how detached the Kremlin's narrative has become from a world easily observable to everybody else. So behind all these phrasing is a simple message. The Kremlin has no intention of stopping the war. It'll continue destroying Ukrainian cities, resources, and lives to satisfy its own fantasy of historical justice. And every promised logical conclusion leads to the same outcome. Another extended crisis for Russia, more economic strain, increased isolation, and fewer people left pretending that the plan ever made any sense to begin with. Now, here's a cautionary tale. In Russian-controlled Donetsk, or all of Russia for that matter, loyalty comes with no guarantees. Not even for the people who dedicate their lives to serving the Kremlin's narrative. Meet Russell Bentley, an American communist who joined the pro-Russian militants in 2014, spent years promoting the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and in 2024, the DPR repaid that loyalty by torturing to death after some militant decided he looked suspicious. In occupied territories, that's all it takes to go from a valued member of the team to a victim. Investigators say 4 DPR militants abducted Bentley, tortured him, then tried to hide the crime by blowing up a car with his body inside. And when that wasn't enough, they moved his remains again. Prosecutors sought sentence from 1.5 to 15 years, the court handed down up to 12. Bentley's widow considers the verdict far too mild, noting the lack of remorse and even basic acknowledgement from those involved. But that's the reality inside the Russian-occupied territories. Brutality is routine, accountability is selective, and even longtime loyalists can disappear the moment someone decides they look out of place. In the end, Bentley wasn't targeted for opposing the system, he was targeted because the system treats everyone as expendable. His death exposes the core logic of Kremlin-controlled structures. They do not protect their own, they consume them. Bentley spent a decade amplifying their propaganda as a committed communist, convinced that he was standing for a just cause. In the end, that cause treated him the way so many similar movements have treated their most devoted believers. Useful one moment, disposable the next. And once he no longer fit the script, the system made sure he didn't appear in the next chapter. So if anyone still expects a moment of common sense from Russia, this week was yet another letdown. Putin's propagandists continue to showcase their full range of talent in lies, intimidation, and pure unfiltered nonsense. At this point, the only consistent thing about their rhetoric is that it always finds a way to get worse. So after destroying Ukrainian cities like Chasiv Yar, Bakhmut, Donetsk, Kremlin mouthpieces now solemnly insist that they do not strike civilian targets in residential buildings. According to their logic, the ruins, the smoke, the craters are all just background details that somehow showed up on their own. And that would already be enough for a full episode of delusion, but it doesn't stop there. The same supposedly non-aggressive occupiers are now threatening Europe, promising to put the Netherlands and Great Britain underwater as if that were an everyday conversation during international relations.
Мы не собираемся нападать на Европу. Они все говорят, там, 29-й, 28-й, 30-й год, что нужно быть готовым, что Россия нападет. Мы не собираемся нападать. Но если Европа хочет с нами повоевать, мы готовы, хоть сегодня. Но президент сказал, прошу учесть, что это будет не та война, которую мы ведем на Украине. На Украине мы действуем хирургическими методами. Ну, имеется в виду, что не наносим удары избегаем ковровых бомбардировок, не наносим удары по гражданской инфраструктуре, прежде всего по жилому сектору крупных городов. Это будет совершенно другая война. Она будет значительно, так сказать, менее продолжительная, но закончиться может тем, что разговаривать после этого, договариваться будет не с кем. Я должен сказать, что ядерное оружие упомянуто не было. Но я думаю, все поняли. Потому что при той разнице потенциалов, я еще раз повторяю, да, они нам могут нанести ущерб, значительный ущерб. Но мы их можем просто уничтожить. Это все-таки разные вещи.
Интересно, они понимают, что произойдет, если, например, ну, скажем, Посейдон жахнет у берегов Голландии? Ну, учитывая, что Голландия и так находится ниже уровня моря, ее сдерживает от негодующей стихии только система плотин.
Не только
они просто вот реально понимают, насколько вот сразу выглядит будет иначе карта Европы.
Голландия, Великобритания.
Ну, про них я очень говорю, эти по списанию сразу.
Да, побережье Средиземного моря, там, Франция, Италия, все это, так сказать, может исчезнуть под толщу морской пучины.
И пучина сия поглотила ее.
So when Putin's propagandists insist they never fire on civilians, and in the next sentence threaten to flood half of Europe, the pattern is clear. They operate in a parallel reality where ruined cities somehow don't count, and Europe is just a target they can drown whenever the script calls for drama. It's not strength, it's a propaganda machine so lost in its own fantasy that it no longer notices how ridiculous it sounds to anyone on the outside. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned.